Okay, it's almost like a tradition at this point. When a new Steven Wilson album comes out, I have to talk about it with one of my favorite people. I got the privilege of having Mark from Spectrum Pulse come in and chat about the latest Steve Wilson album. And first off, huge thank you to Mark for coming on. It was a pleasure and a privilege having him on to bounce ideas back and forth about this new album. And it was an album that I think really needed two people to help flush it out. So, without further ado, let's dive into the conversation that Mark and I had about the latest Steve Wilson album. It's for the underdogs that want to disappear. All right, welcome everybody to a special review of a special album. This album's one of those big releases that I didn't think I could handle just myself, so I got a friend of the channel, Mark from Spectrum Pulse, to kind of help us out. Thanks for jumping on, Mark.
Pleasure for you to have me. This was one, especially after our conversations around Porcupine Tree last year, it really made sense,
Mhm.
especially as I think we're coming at this from two very different angles.
Absolutely. So let's start just by talking a little bit about the different angles. Like, how did you come into Steven Wilson's albums? What were your favorites? And let's just at least get a little bit of context of how we're approaching this album.
Okay, so again, longtime fan of Porcupine Tree in the 2000s. Going into the 2010s, I was really excited to get into Steven Wilson's solo stuff because I had heard fragments of other stuff he'd been working in side projects because he's got ever so many side projects.
Yeah.
But going into the solo albums, I'll admit I really struggled with them for a
Mm,
while.
okay.
Insurgents kind of bounced off me. The movie did not help. Um,
Yeah.
it's aged badly, and I think Stephen
Yeah.
Wilson will admit that too. Um, I couldn't stand Grace for Drowning at all. Um,
Okay. Yeah.
I just found it turgid. I found it overlong. I just felt it didn't mesh with me. The first it started clicking was The Raven That Refused to Sing in 2013. I
Yeah.
think it was close to getting to me, but then came the one-two punch of Hand Cannot Erase and To the Bone. I adore those albums. I think they're both
Interesting.
excellent.
Okay. Okay. I'm sure we'll have a little bit of a conversation about those. And then there's the Future Bites.
Future Bites isn't good. Um,
Yeah.
I really wanted that album to be great. I think we all did. I think that was the first big disappointment we had in 2021. Like we were psyched up for a
Mhm.
new Steven Wilson album, got delayed because of pandemic stuff, and then
Yeah.
it's it's a pop element. It's trying to be satirical. The satire is not very good, and it's frustrating more than outright bad. But I also cannot call it good in good conscience.
Yeah, I'm of the same mind for you about the Future Bites. I thought it was dead on arrival. It was a year and a half too old for me.
Hmm.
I actually prefer listening to the digital deluxe version, which is like 3 hours long or something like that, because of
Really?
all this extra content and extra tracks on it.
Hmm.
But yeah, I wasn't that big of a fan. I much like yourself, I wasn't a big fan of Insurgents. Movie didn't help, but I thoroughly loved Grace for Drowning.
Really?
Um,
Okay.
as a prog fan, I loved his use of the Mellotron. Coming from it from a prog side of things, I like the darker approach. And Raven That Refused to Sing, in my mind, is his masterpiece, and Hand Cannot Erase is his like magnum opus. Like those, for me, are his two big things.
Mm.
I, much like many prog fans, did not appreciate or enjoy To the Bone. I I can at least understand what he was trying to do, but for me, it felt more like a little bit of a flub. Like it was a prog's trying to do pop. And
Yes.
you can do that. There are bands that are currently doing that now, but I feel as though Steven is a little too cynical, a little too dark, a little too up his own arse to really
Mm.
get pop music. That's
See,
just
that's
my
the
take.
interesting thing. I actually kind of liked that To the Bone pushed him away from all some of that darkness that he'd been wallowing in, and it
Mhm.
forced him to embrace more melody. It forced him to embrace song structures that were a little bit more compact. And
Hmm.
again, there's songs on that album that just click. I think that in terms of the ability to take prog structures and melodies and put them into a pop context, I think he did them remarkably well, especially the elements of calling back to his own pop influences that I often
Hmm.
think are underappreciated.
I could agree with that. I could agree with that. I just, for me, it didn't work, and that's just
Yeah,
a taste thing. So
totally.
those are the contexts that we are coming into this album for.
Hmm.
So I'd like to know how are you digesting this? How is this album sitting with you?
I'll be very honest. I struggled with this. I've
Hmm.
been sitting with this album. I've given it lots and lots of listens, and it's a beefy project, especially for a Steven Wilson solo project.
Hmm.
It's over. It's clocking over an hour. You can feel that hour, and the more I listen to it, the more I find things I like, but I also find more things I dislike.
Hmm.
It's one of
Hmm.
those projects that feels like it's got a lot of fragments of great ideas, but it also has a lot of fragments that just do not work at all. I think there's a lot of experimentation. I think that just kind of goes off the rails in ways that sometimes it's interesting, but most of the time it's not.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I'm in a similar boat in that, like many Steven Wilson albums, I do find it frustrating as well because there's a really good album in this hour plus worth of music. I
Yes.
feel like he should have done what he did with To the Bone, which was, sorry, The Future Bites, where there was like this companion album. There was like all these
Mm.
special songs on like a deluxe edition. And he's done that in the past. He did it with Porcupine Tree with The Incident. He's done it
Yep.
with a bunch of other where you had the album proper and then a couple of these bonus tracks in an EP or something that would follow up. And I feel as though if he had removed, say, like, and I know people are going to kind of bitch and moan about this because these are some of the better tracks on there. But the second track of What Life Brings, the duet that he has with
Rock
Nene,
bottom.
yeah, who he's had on many times with Rock Bottom,
Mm.
and the eighth track of Time Is Running Out, if he had removed those tracks, because all the other tracks on here have a very similar feeling. They're very much more like electronical in approach. You know, I'm
Mm.
getting Depeche Mode, I'm getting a lot of that new wave stuff from like the 80s, but even
Yep.
like, you know, playing with that style. But these three tracks feel very out of place. And I know that was part of what Stephen wanted to do with this album is like defies genre. It's not one particular thing, but I'm like, yeah, but then you're just left with this gumbo soup that doesn't really feel like any one thing. So yeah, if you had taken out those three tracks, maybe put them on an EP with one or two other tracks, I think you
Hmm.
could have had something a little bit more, I don't know, unified in approach.
I would
And
agree.
yeah,
Kind of ironic because those are my three favorite songs on the
like
album.
and that's the thing, like these are good tracks, they're very good
Yes.
tracks, and I would agree they're some of the best moments on the album, but it doesn't flow with the rest of the album.
No, it doesn't. And I think some of this is I read a bunch of interviews with Stephen Wilson specifically around this project.
Mm-hmm.
A couple things came to mind immediately. The first of all is that there was a lot of remote work that was done in terms of piecing parts of this album together, which apparently he didn't like at all. You can
Hmm.
tell. The
Mm-hmm.
other thing was that a lot of this album was structured almost with a companion screenplay in mind,
Mm-hmm.
like when you're dealing with the actual content of the project, and we'll get into that later. It's very interesting when you realize that it almost feels like there's large chunks of prog elements, but it's got segments that are not quite driving a plot, but like framing of characters in specific moments and attitudes. So I think that's
Mm-hmm.
why he's trying to build more song focused pieces there instead of the more extended experimental passages.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree with you; it doesn't flow well.
Yeah.
It's very lumpy.
Yeah. Yeah, which like my favorite tracks are obviously some of the longer tracks like
Yeah,
Impossible Tightrope, the last track of Staircase, but I think my favorite one is the Harmony Codex, which I think will be a very divisive track and people will either love it or find it unbearably boring.
I found it not boring per se. I don't mind when Steven Wilson does ambient music, which is
Hmm.
one reason I think it's okay. It's very much it sits in its groove, and I think it was trying to build something well. Because the other thing is that Steven Wilson is still a great producer. Like
Hmm.
that's when I'm looking at the technical elements of this, it's still very refined. There's an element of dynamics where you can appreciate the subtleties in a mix. That's the reason why, again, there's so much of this album that only gets better with repeated listens, and that I can
Hmm.
appreciate, especially in terms of production texture, in terms of subtle melodic shifts, or some of the jazzier elements that come into the fourth track. Name of it
um Impossible Tightrope.
exactly, with some of like
Yeah.
the saxophone that comes in there. That was really nifty.
Yeah.
Um, my frustration with the Harmony Codex is that I was waiting for a progression or a crescendo, and it didn't
Hmm.
happen.
Hmm.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and that's fair. It's funny. I was okay with there not being one, which is so interesting for me because most of the time that's
Mhm,
my biggest criticism. I'm like, I'm waiting for something to happen. It's just wandering the landscape. But
mhm.
I would have almost preferred this to be its own maybe 20-minute track and just allowed it to blossom into something
Breathe.
like Tangerine Dream or
Mhm,
something like Klaus Schultz would do like back in the 70s.
mhm.
So I love how it's very experimental in its approach, but I can definitely see again people being frustrated that it doesn't really go anywhere. But I'm just along for the journey.
The one thing I find kind of fascinating is that when I was listening to Inclination, the opener, the first time, with how
Hmm.
it's really a two parts of the song. Because
Yeah.
it's got the first part that's a lot more, it's building up that churning mix. And then it's kind of where Stephen Wilson sings a little bit more. I honestly feel like that song could have been expanded as well, because the ending feels very abrupt to me. And it feels like it's trying to get into a more song structure. And again, I'm not sure that flatters the track as well as it could, especially as I like the groove there.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's such a strange again, there's those bumps in the road because like I
Mhm.
love Inclination, but I agree it probably could have been like really blossomed out because when we get
Mhm.
into the second track of What Life Brings, it feels very like cut short. I'm not
It's a pop song.
it
It
is a
is
pop
very much a
song.
it's a pop song, and the funny thing is, I'm like, this sounds like something that would have been cut from Lightbulb Son, and I'm like, that's my vibe.
Yeah, that's fair, and I can understand why that would be one of your more favorite tracks. But I don't know because we have this more experimental, this more return to form from that first track. It
Mhm.
felt like a little bit of like really quickly shifting back into reverse. Um, so in terms of
Yeah.
like the tone and whatnot, yeah, it's just a very strange little pop song that's sandwiched between these more experimental. Like I really enjoy that third track of Economy of Scales.
Yes.
Um,
That was
you know,
interesting.
yeah, in more of the production side, and again, Steven is showing us his more like producer hat on this track. He's like, look what I can do with a mixing board.
Yes and no. The thing that I started noticing, especially with economies of scale, is I also reminded how much Stephen Wilson's falsetto can annoy me. Um, the other thing was this is going to be the contentious thing that I know saying this is going to annoy people. Those are
Mhm.
trap drums.
They are.
Yep,
Yep.
those are triplet flows. I recognize how like it's better programmed and they sound great for being trap drums, but it's a weird choice to integrate that sort of texture across this album because it's not the only time it happens.
That's right.
Um, because you see it with the quasi-industrial elements that come up on Beautiful Scarecrow, with how that
Hmm.
groove really gets muscular. And then you have actual brutal facts where he's rapping and he shouldn't. He shouldn't.
Yeah, no. I thought he learned his lesson about his falsetto voice when he did the pin drop on The Raven That Refused to Sing, because that's one of the lower points from that album.
Yeah.
But he still seems to want to do it. I am not sure why. But yeah, it's interesting that he is starting to again try these different things, and the trap beats for me they don't retract too much of my enjoyment. Like it was definitely upon the first handful of listens, I'm like,
Uh-huh.
that's a choice.
Yep.
That's a choice. But I've grown to at least accept them for what they're trying to do. And
Yeah.
for tracks like Actual Brutal Facts, which is one of my more favorable, shorter tracks off of this album, where
Yeah.
I know people will either love or hate his like lower voice on there. Um,
Hmm.
these tracks are reminding me, and I understand why you would find this very frustrating because this is where I'm reminded of his Grace for Drowning album. Because
Yep.
after listening to these tracks, immediately I go and I listen to Grace for Drowning, and enjoy it that much more. It's like, okay, that's where this DNA comes from, and I'm enjoying this. Like I'm hearing Raider all over again with Actual Brutal Facts.
And that's the other thing. Like I can appreciate this, the DNA and what led to it. There is elements where I can appreciate the sonic lineage of where it's coming from. I
Mm-hmm.
think actually engaging with the song Actual Brutal Facts, I find it a little, it's so hilariously edgelord. It's one of
Mm-hmm.
those songs that feels like it was come out, like it would have dropped in like the late 90s on a house track that was trying to bring in a guest rapper. It was trying to be a protest against the man, but a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the facts being stated do not have the bites that they should. Like that was my big point of frustration, especially when you compare it to a track like Beautiful Scarecrow or
Mm-hmm.
Staircase, where the critiques of someone who's attempting to live within the system and is not seeing the rate of return that they want as they're only getting older and it's wearing on them. So I found that to be a much more resonant critique than
Mm-hmm.
the edgelord side that I also thought Stephen Wilson grew out of. But
I kind of hoped that he would grown out of, but yeah, it was just like, oh, bud, I thought we were done with this after Fear of a Blank Planet. Like, I thought we had
yeah.
left that a little bit behind and we have moved on
Mm.
since then. But at least the music for the Actual Brutal Facts is enough to, get me back engaged. And again, I love it because of the ties that it has for Grace from Drowning. But it is
Mm.
one of those tracks that unfortunately I kind of have to turn my brain off in terms of the lyrical content.
I
So
get it.
yeah.
The
Uh,
the funny thing is that I'll go to the pop songs like Rock Bottom with Nanette, and I think she's got such a beautiful voice, and I
yeah.
actually really like her presence on the song as just a counterweight to Stephen Wilson. I think they've got
Mhm.
really, I think they finally have developed really good chemistry, and that's kind of the reason why I think that song can cut loose as much as it can.
It reminded me of like Steven's version of the Peter Gabriel song "Don't Give Up" with
Yep.
Kate Bush.
Hmm.
It's a little bit darker, but it still kind of has that hopeful optimism in the, I don't know, the Steven Wilson way.
For what
You
it
know,
is.
for what it is. And again, it's one of those songs that I really love and I really appreciate, and I love how it grows because it does progress very beautifully, very similar to "Don't Give Up." But
Hmm.
once again, it because it follows up Impossible Tightrope, which is I believe it's the longest track off of the album.
It's either that or Staircase.
Yeah, one or the other. And we had this really powerful, very proggy track that is then met with another, I wouldn't
Pop
necessarily
song.
call this one, yeah, it's like another pop song.
Hmm.
So, and again, I know that's the point, and I don't know if we've touched upon it yet, but the whole album cover of that staircase
Yeah.
picture, and each color is represented by a different song on it because there's 10 colors and 10
Yeah. Hmm.
doers on there. um yeah, Steven has a really hard time of sticking the landing when it comes to a concept, and that's for me the biggest gripe that I have about this album, and it's one that I've mentioned many many times before. If you wanted to do this, that would be great, but I don't know, it feels like all but three tracks are variations of like a grayish blue, and then we have these three very stark yellow, red, and orange tracks just kind of out of nowhere. um
The
it
interesting thing that I
Yeah.
noticed, and this came with a lot of examining of the lyrics and listening to the interviews, 2 points. The first apparently is that the thematic arc or is surrounding like a pair of, I think they're siblings who are trying to understand each other and bounce off each other in odd ways.
Okay.
Where a lot of it is kind of they're almost talking past each other
Mm.
as they finally try to meet at the very end, and that's where an argument happens, something. The key thing is that it's not a linear narrative, which
Gotcha.
honestly makes sense. I'm kind of
Hmm.
okay with that. They did that something similar on Hand Cannot Erase, and that
Yeah.
was fine. Um, I feel like we're missing a component of this
Mm.
because he also said in that interview, as he's thinking about how he wants to play these songs live, and he's trying to think about how the stage element comes through in terms of how he would present these songs. And
Hmm.
I'm sitting there and I'm like, this feels like it's the backdrop of a stage play or like a
Mm.
screenplay of some variety, which is fine, but it does mean we're missing a part of the performance to fill in some of the gaps.
Yeah, and I mean, this was one of my. I don't have too many criticisms about Deadwing, but that was my biggest criticism about Deadwing was we never got the script that this thing was supposed to be made for. So
Yep.
this isn't the first time that Steven has done something similar to this.
Hmm.
So,
The other thing that I think is interesting, and this is where it's kind of funny, is that the other theme is tied with the staircase itself, when that you're
mhm,
ascending the stairs, and that's it's the life, it's the journey, not the destination sort of idea. But the comment that Stephen Wilson said, it really comes out of time is running out, is that once you finally come to learn and know yourself, you recognize you've spent all that time to do so, and oh shit, you don't have as much left. I think
mm,
he is I think he is really grappling with the struggle of getting older.
mhm,
And I think that resonates across a number of these tracks, especially as you have the feel of I'm getting older within this uncaring system that I don't quite understand, but is continuously oppressive. And I'm not happy, and I'm not sure where to direct all of my angst about it.
yeah, and that's fair. I feel like that's also how many people are receiving this album as well. It's like
Yeah.
I don't know how to direct my angst towards this album because there's still quite a bit there. Um, yeah, I'm excited to see where Steven's going to go from here. I
Yes.
also we didn't touch upon, but I also really enjoyed how he decided to roll out this album as opposed to how he rolled out the Future Bites. Because he did those touring things where it was renting out a
Yeah.
theater with like a 7.5.1 surround sound, turned off the lights and just played it for everybody. Um, and the first time I listened to this, I had my pretty good pair of headphones and I could really appreciate the production side of things. But I thought that
Mhm.
was a very interesting way of first introducing everybody to this album. And then
Mhm.
at the beginning of September was like, okay, we're releasing it at the end of September. Here's like the first track. So I at least appreciate the fact that he learned, I don't want to say learned his lesson, but like don't give us one track, don't give us half the album essentially
Yes. Mhm.
before releasing the album so that we can have our minds practically made up by the time the album comes out. So,
Yeah, getting away from the porcupine tree comeback, which I think that was where it kind of got spoiled for both of us.
mhm,
This feels like it's more deliberate, but at the
mhm,
same time, the more deliberate elements make the stuff that feels missing all the more frustrating. I feel it's structured in such an odd way that and it has so much. I would say there's a lot of empty space. Like the
mhm,
album has a lot of those long, repetitive textures where it kind of invites you to insert something of your own thoughts and mindset into it. But at the same time, I'm like, okay, you kind of need a little bit more structure to this. It's one reason I
mhm.
appreciate the pop songs because there's structure, it's
Yeah.
pieces of it that I can string together.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, unfortunately, that's kind of what we got. Like I still think that there's I'm of two minds, right? Like on the one hand, I wanted him to release a shorter, tighter album with just those more electronic sounds and
Uh-huh.
then really flesh out some more of those pop songs.
Hmm.
Almost have like a To the Bone Future Bites album in one camp, and then have like a Grace for Drowning, Hand Cannot Erase album on the other camp. So that,
Right.
and I would have been okay if he released both of those albums like on the same day, because there are artists in the prog sphere that have done similar things like that.
Hmm.
Um, like Devin Townsend putting out Ghost and Deconstruction on the same day, one where it was all metal and the other which was very ambient.
All ambient. Yeah.
Um, and I mean, Steven could have done something very, very similar to some very similar success. But yeah, instead we just kind of get, for me, half an album that I love and was something that I've really been digging into, but the other half that I just find frustrating, and I'm still on the fence on how I feel about this. So
I think I like it. I
yeah.
think I'm going to come here and say it is a good album. I
Mhm.
don't put it near his peak. I don't think I can. Granted, where I think his peak is different than others, and I'm coming from more of a pop context, and that's fine.
Yeah.
But I think this is the sort of project that might be trying. If I thought Steven Wilson was trying to please two audiences, that would be what he's doing.
Mhm.
But I also don't think that's what he's doing. And it's that lack of information where I'm trying to fill in the gaps because thematically it also feels a little undercooked. It's just that there's a space that needs to be filled and it isn't.
Yes. I agree in that. I would also say that it's a good album. I would put this under Grace for Drowning, Hand Cannot Erase, and The Raven kind of in that sequence.
Okay.
But I would turn to this one far sooner than his first album, Insurgents, To the Bone, or The Future Bites. So that's kind of where I am in it.
Where for me, I would say I would go to this before Future Bites, because I
Mhm.
think Future Bites is not good. But I would go to this before Grace for Drowning or Insurgents, at least for me. Like I think To the Bone has that pop element that will draw me back to it consistently.
Mhm.
And whereas this, again, it's got moments, but I feel like again he's trying to mesh a couple of ideas and they don't quite coalesce.
Yeah, yeah, I agree for that. So I know you don't give any ratings anymore.
I
So
will if you want me to.
only if you feel comfortable. Like my rating system is more of like recommendations of how people would listen to it. So mine
Okay.
would be more of like a download, one to download onto your computer to listen to when you want to, but not enough that I would recommend buying in physical format. Somewhere
Hmm.
around there.
I would agree with that. I think it is absolutely worth a listen, and I think
Mhm.
it's worth. I'll actually say it's worth repeated listens because I
Yeah.
do think this grows on you. Like the longer cuts, you will notice more pieces just as it goes along, and I think I can appreciate that at least.
Yeah, and that's something with all Steven's works. The more I listen to it, the more I get out of it, and the more I find things that I didn't notice upon the first handful of listens. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Thanks again for coming out, Mark,
Always a
for
pleasure.
chatting.
Absolutely.
Yeah. If you haven't already, be sure to follow Mark on the socials and on YouTube. I've left all of his links down below in the description. Any parting words that you want to leave our watchers with?
Again, thank you all for watching. If you want to, please give Notes a subscription. He's well deserving of it. They're well deserving of it. And it's again happy to be on board talking about more Stephen Wilson. We'll make it a tradition. We'll see where it goes.
We'll see where it goes. Absolutely. He's got thousands of side projects, and I
Exactly.
just read somewhere that he's in talks with perhaps doing another Porcupine Tree album, but I'm not going to put any weight onto that until I see them starting to work on new material,
Right, for
So
sure. Makes
amazing.
sense.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for watching. And until next time, Notes and Mark, we are out.
Later.